The story of Tamar begins with 3 words: some time passed. It's a signal that we're entering a story midway. What we've missed is the story of David and Bathsheba in the previous 2 chapters. David has returned from war and is now directing his troops from the palace. One afternoon, he lies down for a nap, wakes up, looks out the window, sees a beautiful woman bathing, and thinks, "I want that." He has several wives and many concubines, but he's zeroed in, and he wants what he wants, even though the woman has a husband and isn't available. Why? Because David's the king and has the power to do it. This is what the prophets warned about when Israel started needling them for a king. Kings, they cautioned, are dangerous, even one as righteous as David. Kings succumb to the temptation of their own power. Eventually they overstep and take what doesn't belong to them. So there's a scandal. Bathsheba becomes pregnant, and the cover-up includes killing her husband. Even though the prophet Nathan calls David out on it, the king still gets Bathsheba, who never speaks a single word in the entire story. Who's watching the king during all this? His children. David's sons are watching. Amnon, the firstborn, and Absalom, the 3rd son by another mother. His daughter is watching too, Tamar, Absalom's sister. They all know Dad wanted and took because he could and got away with it. There's a predatory precedent on the loose now, and the ones who are the most susceptible and vulnerable to it are David's family. We can see it prowling as the story continues. David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon fell in love with her. Nobody wakes up one morning and announces, "Today I'll fall in love." You just go down without warning. The problem is Amnon fell for his half-sister Tamar, who's off limits. Most of us have fallen in love with the wrong person. It doesn't matter how old we are or how available we are, it just happens. Ask an adolescent. Middle school is all about falling for the wrong person because everyone's out of your league. And all this drama may be great for the music industry. There would hardly be a hit song playing without it. But it's not so great for the one who falls. Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, because she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. Amnon fell in love, but he didn't fall sick. He made himself ill, which lets us know he's back in charge. What he chooses to do is to cultivate this illness, nourish it, feed it, like an impossible obsession. Why impossible? Not because she's his sister, because she's a virgin. There will be unmistakable physical evidence. David didn't have to consider the virginity issue with Bathsheba. She was married. But with Tamar, Amnon has to consider it. Amnon may not have had control over falling in love, but he did have control over making himself ill because of what he couldn't do to her, which is a stomach-churning phrase at best, but also the chilling sound of a predator sniffing the air. The adjective describing Amnon here is haggard. When you sit around stressed and obsessed all day, losing sleep and weight, you're going to look haggard. People see the change in you and worry. Jonadab, Amnon's friend and cousin, did exactly that. "Son of the king, why are you so haggard morning after morning? Will you not tell me?" Jonadab's concern would be a fine thing, except Jonadab was a very crafty guy, according to the story. That adjective reminds us of Genesis and the serpent, who was craftier than any of the other animals. So now we know all we need to know about Jonadab. He's a snake. Jonadab asks, Amnon tells. But you have to be careful whom you tell. Tell the right person, and the urge to confide may lead to honest healing. Tell the wrong person, and a world of hurt follows. The ship could have turned around right here if Amnon had told a wise friend who would have said something like, that's tough, but we're going to get through this together because you know that this can't happen, right? Now, how many of us have ever gotten bad advice from a friend? Or how many of us have ever deliberately gone to the friend who we knew would give us bad advice because it's what we wanted to hear? What is Jonadab's advice? Lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill. And when your father comes to see you, say to him, let my sister Tamar come and give me something to eat, and prepare the food in my sight, so that I may see it and eat it from her hand. Amnon does as Jonadab schemes. And here comes David to check on his firstborn son. Pretending to be ill, Amnon repeats Jonadab's words. Please let my sister Tamar come and make a couple of cakes in my sight so that I may eat from her hand. David doesn't pick up on his son's request, or he doesn't want to pick up on it, which is understandable. To acknowledge that there might be something wrong here is venturing into unthinkable territory. We don't gravitate toward the unthinkable, especially with our own children. The precedent that David unleashed is roaming the palace grounds, and there are definite warning signs. Amnon is haggard, which raises concerns. He wants Tamar alone in his room, which raises eyebrows. Should David have noticed and been alarmed? Yes. David sent home to Tamar, saying, go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him. What would David really have to do to think the unthinkable about Amnon? He'd have to look at himself in an agonizingly clear mirror, and that would reveal all his actions with Bathsheba, the ones Amnon has been studying and fantasizing about, and now is asking his father to collude in. Come on, Dad. You know what I want. It could have gone differently, but then David would have had to do something even harder than confessing to the prophet Nathan. He would have had to turn his gaze on his own actions and admit how they've shaped his own children. When nighttime predators are on the hunt within the walls of the palace, everyone, from the king to the servants, will eventually come within range, and each one will have decisions to make. David orders Tamar to Amnon's quarters, and she goes. Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, where he was lying down. She took dough, kneaded it, made cakes in his sight, and baked the cakes. Then she took the pan and set them out before him, but he refused to eat. She was there for a while, performing each one of those things. He sits back, watches her, feasts his eyes, which is exactly what he wanted, and what his friend and his father helped him orchestrate. It's the prelude. She doesn't say a word, just finishes the task and sets the pan before him, but he refuses to eat. because he has other plans. To pull them off, he first has to clear the room. Amnon said, "Send out everyone from me." So everyone went out from him. The spotlight suddenly shifts to the bystanders who were also in the room, servants most likely, his and hers. Even though something's going on here that everyone can smell and see, they all get up and leave her alone with him. There's a serious power dynamic here. The prince gives the orders, the servants must obey. If they don't, they lose their jobs or their heads. It makes things complicated because no matter what they do, lives and livelihoods are at stake. Who doesn't know what that's like? To look the other way because someone told you it was your job. To leave the room because someone said, "You're not liable and you're not responsible for what happens here. Just do your job." Feelings are supposed to be irrelevant, which is why we say inane things like, "Nothing personal, I'm just doing my job." But it's always personal when someone is at risk. It's personal for Tamar. We may not be servants of an ancient Near Eastern king, but we know what it's like to be part of the crowd that's watching, witnessing, and choosing not to get involved, choosing to hang back when the drama erupts, choosing to remain silent when the violence is done, choosing to protect ourselves rather than the person we aren't responsible for, ignoring her bruises and her black eye, too. It's none of our business. It's not our job. Tamar delivers what is probably the most rhetorically perfect argument in the Bible against rape in 7 irrefutable points. No. I'm saying no. You're my brother. We don't do this in Israel. It's not who we are. This act is vile. What would happen to me? I would have nowhere to go. What would happen to you? You would be one of the scoundrels in Israel. If this has to happen, at least talk to Dad first, because we both know he won't withhold me from you. It's an astounding speech, especially when contrasted with Bathsheba's silence. But it doesn't work. Amnon was stronger. He forced her because he could. He wanted and took because he could. David's precedent has struck another member of the family. In a rage of loathing, Amnon calls his servant and orders him to put this woman out and bolt the door after her, as if the very sight of her now were abhorrent. Tamar responds by tearing her robe, putting ashes on her head, and taking to the corridors, crying aloud as she goes. It's a public sign of mourning and prophecy, because the prophets of Israel always cried aloud in times of injustice. She makes sure that everyone in the palace sees and hears, even though Amnon wouldn't. She makes a scene, one that any activist would admire. Look at this. Listen to me scream. I'll make sure your eyes are open to what we've become in this palace. Tamar's brother Absalom advises her to be quiet. Advice that women are still expected to obey today, in which they're still speaking up to expose. David hears of these things and is angry, but would not punish his beloved firstborn son, which continues even today in our world to play out in the sentencing of most men convicted of assault. And then comes Absalom. Will he do something? No. He speaks neither good nor bad to Amnon. We aren't sure whether he's biding his time to make a play for the throne or truly sickened by his brother's actions. But we do know there's nothing between these brothers now but hate. Absalom takes her into his home and she remains a desolate woman. And that's where the story ends. Tamar seems so powerless in this story. She is told what to do first by one man and then by another and has no choice but to follow their instructions. In her book, Texts of Terror, theologian Phyllis Tribble describes how the Hebrew grammar tends to wrap Tamar's name right into the middle of each sentence, so that she is literally and figuratively surrounded by powerful men. But there's one way Tamar has her own power. She has the power of her voice. There were only two people in that room to hear the conversation and witness the rape: Amnon and Tamar. And still Tamar's voice survived. We know what she said. Tamar was able to tell someone the story of what happened to her and what she said. That person was able to hear her, remember her story, and share it at the right time with the right person until this story made its way to us. Until thousands of years later, we know Tamar's name. We know her tragedy. We know her courage. Across all the barriers of history, culture, and shame, we can listen to Tamar's voice. And if we listen to Tamar, then we can't help but also listen to the voices of women today. Because for all our modern enlightenment, we still have not rooted out rape and abuse from our world. There is no place, no race, and no social class that's immune from domestic and sexual violence. If we listen to Tamar, then perhaps we can find the courage to raise our own voices, to say our own no. There's a story about the old hymn, In the Garden. Not everyone likes that song. A retired seminary professor named Tex Sample said it had bad theology, that it was too focused on the individual and full of escapist spirituality. He made fun of it one day in his classroom, singing it in a mocking tone. But after class, one of the students approached him. She told him that starting when she was 11, her father had sexually abused her again and again. After every one of those ordeals, she said, I would go outside and sing that song to myself. I go to the garden alone while the dew is still on the roses, and he walks with me and talks with me and tells me that I am his own. Without that song, I don't know how I could have survived. Tex, don't you ever make fun of that song in my presence again. If we wonder where God is in this story, I think one answer is that God is walking with Tamar. God's walking with every woman who has suffered misogyny, domestic abuse, sexual violence. What Paul says to the Ephesians is true, that all bad things need to be exposed to the light. Only when we talk about this, when we name it, when we believe those who have been victimized, will we begin to heal it and make this a better, safer world to live in. And that's why we need to hear Tamar's story. It's why we have to talk about things that are uncomfortable, because by bringing things into the light, we slowly begin to change things. We begin to give hope. We begin to tell women it doesn't have to be this way, because we believe them and we want to change things. May we be silent no more, but expose every act of darkness so that we can live in the light. May it be so. Amen.